Yeah. Thank, yeah, thank you for having me. And it seems like a very timely topic. Um, mm, uh, for obvious reasons. Um, I mean, everybody's in danger of feeling hopeless um, now. And and as practitioners of the Dharma, I think we have to think carefully about how the issue of hope relates to our practice. Um, as I mentioned last time, I started thinking about this topic a little bit like almost a year ago when I had an, a an intuition things might go the wrong way. Um, and I've been reading more about what other people, teachers and other people have been saying that seems related, and trying to weave together my own thoughts. And yeah, being invited to give this talk gives me an opportunity to further pursue this. So I'll just share what I've worked out. Maybe I'll talk for about an hour and then people can ask any questions or offer any lamentations that, yeah, that you're feeling to share. Where, oh, here we go. Let's get reached here. Okay, so second night of Hope in the Dharma. There'll be okay, so my main thesis, which I gave last time, hasn't changed since last week, unsurprisingly. So I will be explaining that idea of wise hope as distinct from ordinary hope in yes, from some different angles, and including a few of the same texts, the root texts, and but then some different ideas woven in. And mm, last time, Bryant Guy, who was here, was sort of pushing me in the direction of focusing a little bit more on emptiness, which is the my main area of research and scholarly exploration is Tsongkhapa's idea of emptiness, really.
Just arrived.
Oh, hi, hey, Brian. Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to weave a little bit more of that in this time, but um, I'm not going to make the whole talk about that. But of course, if people have any questions about emptiness, uh, then you can ask them um, at the end of the PowerPoint. So this is I'm sort of taking as the root text comes from the Pali Canon, the Anguttara Nikaya. The Buddha says there are three kinds of people in the world: the hopeful, the hopeless, and the one who has done away with hope. I mean, you would think that that latter would be the same as the hopeless, but the rest of the sutta, which isn't super long, goes on to explain what each of these three people is like. And in that context, it becomes very clear that hope means expectation. So the hopeful people are the ones who have expectations about the future. The hopeless have no expectations whatsoever. And the one who has done away with hope doesn't have any expectations, but then nonetheless has a practice and a positive trajectory that could, yeah, open up into positive things depending on other circumstances. So the message I get from this is that ordinary hope that's based in expectations is looking forward to or grasping after future appearances in cyclic existence. You know that when you practice the three main aspects of the path, right? Um, the first, Ngenjung, determination to be free from cyclic existence. The practice involves, in part, first doing a series of practices to stop looking forward to appearances within this lifetime and then further doing additional meditations to stop looking forward to appearances in future lifetimes. So that's what I take to be expectation, the sense of grasping after future appearances within cyclic existence. And I think it's that exact thing, which is that's really the main meaning of the ordinary English word hope when you look it up, is that it does tend to go in the direction of optimism, and it tends to focus on the idea of positive expectations. And last time I had a quote from Roshi Joan Halifax, in which she was reflecting on her own sort of intellectual explorations of this issue. And she said, well, when I first started thinking about it, hope felt un-Buddhist to me. So I've like, yeah, if you start, I don't know, if you start to think about it, this is a thought that naturally crosses your mind. Um, so the idea is have a realistic or wise hope, and the idea that this can motivate us to take action rather than being paralyzed. So in this sense, there are the hopeless ones, as in the Anguttara Nikaya, are pessimists, and that nothing we do will make any difference. Then the optimists who are grasping after future appearances and striving toward them and feeling crushed when they don't appear. And then observant realists. Observant realists, is the idea, the ones who have done away with hope in the sense of ordinary expectations. So in the sutta, the example is first given of people who are in a bad socioeconomic situation and either just resign themselves in despair to that situation or have social climbing ambitions. And then a third category of person who engages in productive activity, right? But without some fixed idea that this will necessarily lead to higher social status. And then having given that as, I would say, an analogy, right? The Buddha then says, applies it to spiritual attainment, right? People who don't have people who don't think spiritual practice can possibly do any good because they're pessimists won't engage in it in the first place. But then, as we know, it's really hard, given that we're not awakened people, to engage in some practice without having some kind of hope or expectation, grasping after some kind of attainment that comes from it, right? But that kind of grasping after attainment is exactly what we're encouraged to be letting go of through the practice itself. And that's kind of the paradox that is set up and explored in all of the Mahayana sutras, pretty much, that the bodhisattva attains by way of non-attainment, doesn't think of herself as having attained or being attained, and is therefore attained, right? So the example that I gave last time of the realist who actually does something, right, is Barbara Kingsolver's quote is like, well, the bad winter is coming, and if you're a pessimist, you just like everybody's going to freeze to death or starve. And then the optimist is think, it'll be all right. And some of the it'll be all right people are thinking God will provide. If that's one way to be optimistic, right? And that's in that way you can become, in some forms of optimism encourage just as much passivity as pessimism does, if you see what I mean. I mean, not all forms of optimism do. Some encourage activity that sets you up for crushing disappointment, but some forms of optimism are just like, don't worry, it'll be okay. And I've actually met people like that, like well, after 9/11, they're just saying, well, no big deal, God's plan is unfolding. And there are people, I don't know about, in New York, but there are people like that here in the Midwest for sure. So as I said last time, yeah, influenced by the stuff I've been reading, especially Joan Halifax, I'm going to go with the idea of wise hope, being realistic hope, hope that has no expectation. And it's based on, so that then, maybe some people might want to use a word other than hope for it, like commitment or faith. But this is the kind of hope that's grounded in reality, right? So I see it as in the Buddhist context, wise hope is based on uncertainty, right? Which refers to the ultimate reality of emptiness and the idea that everything's constantly changing and everything's open and interconnected, right? And so the complexity of that is beyond calculation and beyond our possibility of anticipation. And so we never know what's going to happen. Things have multiple downstream consequences, and sometimes something that seems to have no effect on the world ends up maybe decades later being really important, and it could be in a way very different than people thought. So we really don't we really wise hope knows that we don't really know. But at the same time, it's based on values. It's based on if the ultimate wisdom is this pointing at the ultimate uncertainty of things. At the same time, at the conventional level, we have values of commitment of the bodhicitta, the aspiration to take care of all the suffering beings of the world to the greatest extent that we can become capable of. Yeah, so we make commitments. We undertake precepts, and we commit ourselves to engaging in loving care for other suffering beings and to the extent that we can. And so when you have those two things together, this is like the two wings of the path, right? It's wisdom that we don't know the future. We really don't know anything in any absolute way. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. But in the context of emptiness, you can say that we know things, but we never know them in an absolute way, right? So there's always an uncertainty factor. Things that we think we know could turn, and we have good reason to think that we know, could turn out to be wrong, right? In the context of emptiness. But at the same time, it's also wise to know that our choices matter because of emptiness, implying that everything is dependently arisen. Things influence other things. So our choices are part of that intricate shifting matrix of interconnectedness, right? And we don't know all the ripples that our choices send out in different directions, right? Well, we really can never know, right? Yeah, but they're having some effect for sure, right? Because they're creating ripples in the pond of space-time. So this idea relates to the idea of form and emptiness, or conventional truth and ultimate truth. Uncertainty, I'm saying uncertainty and values. Uncertainty is the wisdom side of the path. Wisdom refers to, in this context, the ultimate wisdom, knowing the fundamental nature of reality, or other insights that take us in that direction, like realizing that the person doesn't substantially exist, or realizing that things are all going to fall apart someday, and the United States will not always exist because it's impermanent, and realizing further that, in fact, the United States of this moment has already passed away, because I'm talking in a moment that's past when I was speaking before, and everything is continuously changing, right? So wisdom is on that side, on the constant openness, interconnectedness, lack of essential fixed nature in things. I mean, people talk about it in different ways, right? I talk about usually emptiness, but in large swaths of the Buddhist world, there's different ways of pointing at that. And the values side of the path, right, is the method side, right? So we have wisdom and method, the two wings of the bird that carry the bodhisattva across the ocean of suffering, right? Um, so this is where we have our commitments, love, compassion, and also, practical wisdom. So there is wisdom on the value side too, but it's like knowing uh, skillful pedagogy, skillful ways of caring for people. Um, Good intentions are good, but if we really have good intentions to help others, then the first thing we should be thinking about is whether our ideas about how to do that are going to be actually helpful or just make us feel good about ourselves, right? So, yeah, practical wisdom involves studying and figuring out how to be most effective in caring for certain people in certain situations. And that's the conventional truth side. So you have the ultimate truth of emptiness and the conventional truth of all these ordinary appearances of things which are themselves empty of any intrinsic fixed nature, right? So this is the classic expression in the Pali Canon of this idea of dependent arising. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. So, in that particular sutta, it goes on to talk about the 12 links of dependent arising as the thises and the that's. But I mean, it's a general principle that extends throughout the Buddhist tradition. And it's just like this is X and that is Y. For any X that exists, it's the very fact of its existence. As it passes away, it serves as one of the causes of Y coming into existence, right? Yeah, everything is like that. And this is a fundamental. I had to search around a little bit to find exactly where in the Pali Canon this quote is, but this is a very frequently quoted passage from the Pali Canon where the Buddha says that this idea of dependent arising that things don't exist in and of themselves, but they do exist. They come into being, they arise, but only independence on other things. That is the Dharma. That's what the Buddha says in the Majjhima Nikaya. So then working exactly from that, Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way identifies emptiness, the lack of things being able to exist in and of themselves, with dependent arising. Whatever arises dependently doesn't exist in and of itself. And that's what it means to be empty, to lack any ability to exist in and of itself, right? And things being dependently imputed as this or that because they conventionally function in that way for us, right? This is the middle way, avoiding the extremes of nihilism and absolutism. Everything is dependently arisen for Nagarjuna, even emptiness, even Buddha, right? Um, and he has, in fact, a whole chapter on the Tathagata, which means the Buddha and how the Buddha is empty. So for that reason, there is nothing whatsoever that is not empty. In order for things to work and function and exist, serve as causes and conditions, they have to be empty, right? Otherwise, they couldn't change and therefore they couldn't work as causes. So this idea of dependent arising then is called in the tradition the king of reasonings, because dependent arising is its meaning is so close to that of emptiness. It's like the flip side of emptiness. If you add in the fact that things exist, but they don't exist in and of themselves because they're empty, then that entails dependent arising, that they exist in dependence on other things. So they're equivalent. They're often identified with one another. Technically, they're not exactly the same because emptiness is the lack of a quality of essential existence. And without that quality, dependent arising flows. Yeah. So the dependent arising is said to be the best kind of reason for meditating on emptiness because it cuts directly against both the extremes of nihilism and absolutism. Things arise, dependent arisings, therefore they arise, therefore they exist, and therefore you can't say that there is nothing or that nothing matters at all because something's going to happen, right? But on the other hand, things are dependent. They're not self-instituting, right? And therefore, they don't have any absolute fixed nature of their own. Yeah. So I just, this is a little bit thinking about nihilism and absolutism. It seems to me that nihilism, extreme nihilism goes, that nothing exists or that nothing matters, that our choices don't matter. This seems to go in the direction of pessimism, right? Instead of realism. And absolutism, feeling anxious about the unsteadiness of our lives and the world around us, and therefore constructing in our imagination and grasping after some solid objective thing, right? This seems to be linked to optimism that, yeah. And so this tendency to exaggerate how real things are, to take things as existing by way of their own nature, it's kind of like it should be obvious that that can't really be the case, but it isn't. In fact, it's our reflexive innate tendency, the fundamental delusion that grounds cyclic existence, to take things as having more objective or intrinsic reality than in fact they have. And therefore, it's good medicine for a lot of us, not necessarily every person, right? But it's good medicine for a lot of us to use words like emptiness because of their negativity. It is a counter, is a remedy, for our innate tendency to superimpose some extra reality mayonnaise over the top of the things that appear to us. We need to like drop that away so stuff can flow and we can see how it connects to everything else, right? Yeah. I mentioned that because, all right, you'd think if you're going to start a new religion, you probably there would be some concern in the focus groups about having emptiness be your watchword. Doesn't, yeah, a little bit on the downside to people's minds. So Tsongkhapa, right, really stresses that awakening, by which I'm becoming fully awakened as a Buddha, becoming the best possible helper of beings, it absolutely requires both ultimate truth of emptiness and the conventional truths of all these different appearances, which are the things that are empty. Both exist, right? And they always exist exactly together, right? Neither, it's crucial for Tsongkhapa to argue at some length in his text that ultimate truth doesn't supersede or cancel out conventional existence. Because if it did, then you wouldn't have compassion. Wouldn't have living beings, right? If emptiness destroyed, was a way of saying, oh, really, none of this stuff exists, then why would there be Dharma, right? So Tsongkhapa argues that a Buddha, a perfect helper, has two kinds of embodiment, as the Mahayana tradition teaches, and the form bodies, the bodies that exist in the Pure Land, and the bodies that all the forms that manifest in the world, these cannot arise without the practice of method, of compassion, and so forth. And therefore, they depend upon conventional phenomena. You can't really become a Buddha without practicing generosity, right? And if all you can know and all you can see is emptiness, there's not going to be a lot of practice of generosity going on, or ethics, because ultimately good things are empty of being intrinsically good and bad things are empty of being intrinsically bad. And if all you're seeing is emptiness all the time, you don't have any kindness. You don't have any basis for it, right? So the whole idea of kindness that His Holiness the Dalai Lama takes as his religion, right? Yeah, it depends upon conventional phenomena existing and not being canceled out by the fact that they're empty. On the other hand, truth bodies, the Buddha's wisdom and the sphere of reality that it knows, the full scope of emptiness, these depend upon the practice of ultimate wisdom, understanding emptiness or the ultimate reality. So just to, I don't know, you've heard in various presentations of the Dharma, in tenet systems, for example, people say, well, basis, path, and fruit. If you want to describe what Svatantrika says, or what Yogacara says, or what the Vaibhashikas say, a way to organize a presentation is say, okay, what do they think exists? What is the practice they think we should be doing? And what do they think the payoff's going to be, right? And that's basis, path, and fruit. So this is what Tsongkhapa is saying. If you think that emptiness or ultimate reality cancels out the practical, conventional, dependent arising, right? Then you don't have a basis for attaining the full personhood of Buddha. Conventional as part of the basis is necessary to have practices of ethics and commitment and care. And this culminates in, along with the other practices in the form bodies at the fruit level, and the ultimate practice culminates, when also augmented with method practices, culminates in the truth bodies of a Buddha. So who said all this? This is actually, that last sort of explanation is derived from Tsongkhapa Losang Trungpa's Lamrim Chemo Great Exposition of the Stage of the Path, which, as Veronica mentioned, I was one of the translators of and one of the editors of putting that together in 3 volumes in English. So this is a rabbit duck. I use this when I try to talk about conventional and ultimate truths, conventional ultimate reality, or the relationship of emptiness and dependent arising. It can be useful for talking about other ideas as well. But the idea here you can see is, if you can look at this and see it as a rabbit, in which case it's facing to our right as we look at the screen. All right. And the protuberances on our left are the rabbit's ears, but it's pretty much equally legitimately interpretable, right, as being a duck, and the eye is still the eye. But now rabbit's ears are the bill, right? And this optical illusion is a single drawing can like equally seem to appear as 2 contradictory things that can't actually be right there the same. And it's like the idea of emptiness and conventional phenomena. They're not separated by even a hair's breadth. They're always right here exactly together. In order for this to be a table under my laptop, it has to be an empty table. Yeah. And emptiness isn't anywhere else than it's just a way of talking about how these phenomena in the world can possibly function. They function because they're not locked in and frozen with some essential nature. They're constantly interacting and flowing from moment to moment. So when you look at things, in a practical way, you can see one thing that is true about the table. But when you look at it in a deeper way, you can see another thing that is also true. And that is that the table is completely empty of any intrinsic tableness. It manages to be a table without having any objective tableosity over on its own side out there in the world, right? And that's Madhyamaka philosophy. So coming back to hope, hope that is wise hope that goes beyond ordinary hope. I used this example last time. I find it really a good example from Thich Nhat Hanh talking about building shelter for refugees during the Vietnam War, and the shelters are bombed out, and they rebuild them, and then they're bombed out over and over and over again, right? Yeah. And he says, we rebuilt the houses a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time, right? And then he derives his sort of philosophical conclusion from that, which I bolded this time. If you run away from suffering, you can't find happiness. We should face our suffering and try to identify its roots, right? That's the important thing, right? Not. I would say think about applying that to our current political situation, right? Yeah. Only then can we gain understanding and cultivate compassion. Thich Nhat Hanh. There's Thich Nhat Hanh. I decided to put some pictures of the people that I was quoting in here this time because they have, some of them have some inspirational as well as illustrative value. And so I've mentioned Roshi Joan Halifax several times, but one of the people that she seems to have been inspired by in her recent talks about hope is Rebecca Solnit, and her book about this is called Hope in the Dark. So that's an interesting book, and she's a fantastic writer. She first seemed to get really famous for an essay called Men Explain Things to Me, about how she would go to cocktail parties, and whatever the conversation was about, there would be a man who would try to explain it to her, not realizing that she had already written a book about it because she's written several books about several different things. And she's just a beautiful, she's a great thinker, but also a beautiful stylist. Whether you agree with everything she says or not, her prose is crystal clear. So she wrote a book on hope, and it seems to really inspire Joan Halifax.
Professor?
Yeah.
We have a hand raised from Min.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see what Ming has to say. Where is Ming? Oh, Min. Well, should we ask Min to unmute? Min.
Oh, hi. Oh, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, it's great to see you. Yes, thanks for coming back after so many years, maybe. Actually, I have a question. So I think I think in most of Buddhist country, or all of the Buddhist country, I think the idea of dependent origination is one of the main theme for motivating action. But I think it's like I think the idea here is that okay, as a person, for example, in let's say in this life, you have a lot of problem with studying for mathematics, so maybe you go to Buddhist temple and the Buddhist monk say, oh, you have a lot of problem with your issue with mathematics, maybe something in your mind isn't quite click, maybe some ignorance somewhere. So to put in a cause, so it's used to explain like the reason why your life situation is not quite what you expect it to be, and then there's a reasoning say, okay, you want to get better in math in the next exam or in the next life. What you want to do this life is to want to study more math, maybe do a bit of concentration meditation, do a little bit of mantra, for example, and so so I think, let's say, can we apply kind of like a similar logic here in the sense that if we want our society to be like better, fairer, more democratic, more stable, so is there like a cause that we could put in somehow at a like personal level, and then somehow it's sort of like manifesting into like a better society forward, or maybe this life, maybe next life, I don't know. I think Buddhists usually have multiple lifetime enterprise.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, you're right. The concept of dependent arising, and that's why I was quoting the Pali Canon and laying out the basic idea of dependent arising is shared throughout the Buddhist world. And it's fundamental that the choices we make are really important parts of the web of causation. And so in the context of how you're applying it, the choices we make to engage in kind and virtuous actions, actions of generosity, actions that inspire other people to refrain from violent actions or to cultivate patience. These tend, right, in the direction of promoting good effects in the future for ourselves and others around us. Okay. And this works throughout the Buddhist world as a foundation for ethical practice. And I guess I would extend that to social norms as well, that actions have consequences. And so we should, choose to do positive actions to have positive consequences for ourselves and our society in this life in the future. Absolutely. So in this particular context, starting with Nagarjuna and continuing through a huge swath of the Mahayana tradition, right, which includes the Zen tradition, and the variations of Zen that extend throughout East Asia. There's the idea that emptiness and dependent arising are two ways of talking about the same thing. The only reason that things can function as causes is because they don't have any fixed nature of being exactly what they are and not changing at any particular moment in time. Things are not set up as intrinsically being what they are, right? They come into being only in dependence on other things. So the flip side of dependent arising is emptiness, that things lack their own mode of being, their own way of being, right? And that's what opens up. You don't have to apply emptiness, I guess, to get to the idea of uncertainty. But for the sake of the conversation about realistic hope, yeah, we have to get to the idea of uncertainty. And in the Tsongkhapa lineage, which is the ancestry of the foundation for the preservation of the Mahayana tradition, of which Shantideva Center is part, this is like the core idea is ultimately all things are empty of their own inherent existence, and that's why they work, and that working of them as cause and conditions is what all Buddhists are referring to as dependent arising. Yeah. It is true, if you read Nagarjuna's text, that some Buddhists hear teachings about emptiness as negating or undermining or refuting dependent arising. So if that's the case for you, then maybe at a particular point in time if something undermines your confidence that actions make a difference, then maybe it's not a good medicine for you. But Nagarjuna's argument that becomes Tsongkhapa's argument, right? Therefore becomes Lama Yeshe's argument, right? And so forth, is that, emptiness is completely not only compatible with dependent arising, but it's the only reason that things can be dependent arisen is because they don't have any fixed or locked in essential nature of their own. They exist only interdependently, right? This is what Thich Nhat Hanh says, right? For example, in the Vietnamese Buddhist tradition. Okay, I guess I'll go back to my PowerPoint. Share. I can find it. Oh yeah, here it is. Yeah. So Rebecca Solnit, this is a quote, or it might be slightly adapted or paraphrased, but it's basically a quote from Hope in the Dark. We are now destroying the nature upon which our lives are depend. The ocean, the atmosphere, uncounted species of plants, insects, and birds. Yeah. We know our lives depend on the ecosystem. Also, we can expect that wars will be breaking out. As food becomes scarce, the planet heats up, species will die out. We know, this is why people get so down, right? But how many beings die, how much they suffer, how hot it gets, and what survives, right? The coming years. This in part depends upon our choices. The things we do make a difference, right? And she says, it is always too soon to give up. Yeah. There's Rebecca. Yeah. So, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the novelist, is often quoted as saying, the mark of an intelligent person is they can hold two contradictory ideas in their mind at the same time. And usually people just stop with that. But the next sentence is, one should be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. That's his example of what it means to have two contradictory ideas held in your mind. And of course, that's what we're getting at here. To see that in a conventional sense, things are hopeless and that it's not realistic to have positive great expectations, to use Rip Dickens. Yeah, but nonetheless, our determination, our bodhicitta, our motivation, our determination, our commitment to do everything we can in a positive direction. And Václav Havel says the same thing. It sort of struck me, these two quotes, it's like you find Martin Luther King and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Rebecca Solnit and Václav Havel all saying things that add up to the same thing that Thich Nhat Hanh is saying. And it begins to, these things all fit together. It seems that, a lot of these wise people have reached, even from within different traditions, this same kind of conclusion about hope. Havel says, hope is not dependent on some particular observation or an estimate of the situation. It's an orientation of the spirit, of the heart, and it's anchored somewhere beyond the horizon. It's an ability to work for something because it's good. And he doesn't say it, but he means not because it's likely, not because it's likely, not because you can count on it, right? Just because it's good, right? Yeah. And in fact, the effects of our actions can be very indirect, very long-term, very obscure to us, right? I feel this all the time when I'm teaching college students, right? Sometimes I hear from ones in the future, but most of the time I spend my, lifeblood energy, trying to share ideas with them and motivate them to, engage with curiosity and commitment. And I generally speaking, don't have a lot of feedback in terms of how much benefit that's actually having, right? But I feel like I have to be determined and committed and confident that it is having some benefits and that I just don't always see them. So this is one of the main inspirations of Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit's book, is that a lot of good can come out of small things in unexpected ways. And one of the examples she has is the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, signed by John F. Kennedy, doesn't restrict the number of nuclear weapons that can be involved in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Rather, it restricts nuclear testing so that it can't be done in space, it can't be done in the air, it can't be done under the water. Basically, that leaves underground. Nuclear testing of nuclear weapons has to take place underground. Of course, before that, we had been testing bigger and bigger nuclear weapons, right? Yeah, initially, right? And in the Southwest, and then out blowing up islands in the Pacific. And then the Soviets were blowing up, showing that they could blow up even bigger bombs. And all these bombs were spreading radioactive particles into the atmosphere. And ultimately, they were getting into breast milk. And it was shown that there was radioactive strontium in baby teeth. When baby teeth fell out, right, and new teeth grow in, you could analyze these baby teeth and find that they had strontium-90 in it. Well, right, this led to a bunch of people making various efforts to try to change that. And one of those was a group of women. It was sort of Mothers Against Open Air Nuclear Testing. That wasn't their exact name. But yeah, they organized across the United States starting in 1961. And some of these women, a small group of them, were protesting in the rain outside the White House. I have a picture in my mind, of this group of women standing around with signs in the rain outside the White House, and everybody's ignoring them. But in those days, Benjamin Spock was the big thing in childcare. Sure, my parents learned everything they knew about childcare from Dr. Spock, and he was inspired by seeing these women, and he was interested in infant and child welfare, and this drew his attention, and then he became a big advocate of a nuclear test ban treaty and helped use his influence to push the treaty forward, right? So last time I talked about Olive Schreiner, and I thought I would just hit her again with so she lived from 1855 to 1920, and in South Africa. Her parents were missionaries there, and basically she created a kind of secular and slightly mystical, though kind of visionary. I mean, mystical not in a religious sense, but I don't know, a visionary secular version of her parents' Christian faith, feminist, anti-racist, but never especially radical, instead kind of focusing on promoting understanding between different kinds of people. And I don't know, do you know what I'm saying? I like to imagine that in some indirect karmic way, right, this kind of person, on the ground in South Africa, right, at this time was sort of, her actions did not bear fruit in the elimination of sexism and racism in South Africa and in her lifetime. But yeah, one of her books she dedicates to a young girl, saying that, yeah, she has the idea that maybe the things that she's dreamed of might actually come about within the lifetime of that young girl. Well, maybe it didn't come about in the lifetime of that young girl, but ultimately apartheid was completely destroyed. And so her book, she imagines a woman, right, journeying across a desert, coming to a river, and there's a rushing river, and she can't get over to the other side, to the green pastures of the promised land. And then a man appears there, right? And he says, well, people have to go down and to the river and die and drown and make a bridge with their bodies so other people can go across. But the very first people who go down, their bodies will be swept away and they'll never be heard of again, and their bodies will not even build a bridge. And the man, who represents wisdom, he says, yeah, so what? They're swept away. They're never heard anymore, right? What of it? When I'm reading this, I'm thinking, well, that's sort of like what happened with Olive Schreiner, right? She's not heard of. She's swept away. Yeah. He said, well, what of them? And he says, well, they make a track to the water's edge. Yeah. There's thick brush on the bank. Somehow you have to beat a track down to the water's edge before there can even begin to be a bridge, right? And ultimately, right, all sentient beings will cross over the bridge, right? And yeah, she headed down the path to the river. So I used these quotes last time too. Carol Arnett is a Cherokee poet that I happen to know. Published a lot of books, but in one of them he says this. This is the whole poem. Some will tell you it doesn't matter, but every single thing matters, and nothing good happens fast. I like that nothing good happens fast fits with Tsongkhapa's gradualism. And then, George Eliot's quote in Middlemarch about the good of the world depends on unhistoric acts, things that the people who are doing them didn't really anticipate some great positive consequences in the future, but the accumulation of these hidden bodhisattvas, doing things just because they're good, right? Never being remembered, right? That this creates a lot of the good that is in the world today, she argues, Yeah. To have the tomb of the unknown bodhisattva. There's George Eliot. So I have a few quotes here that I feel like are sort of saying the same thing in different ways. And the first one is Albert Einstein. He says, a human being is part of the whole that we call the universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings as separate from all the rest of us. And this is an optical delusion. And this delusion is like a prison that restricts us to our personal desires and affection for just a few persons nearest. Our task is to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. Of course, he wrote this in German. Seems really extraordinary, if I didn't know it were by Einstein, I would guess it could have been by the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh. But no, this sort of fits what I was saying earlier, is like you start to see this resonance between people who are part of very different intellectual traditions, sort of reaching these same kinds of insights. You're familiar with this individual. And he has his own way of saying what Einstein just said, of course. This is actually from the books that Veronica referred to earlier, From Here to Enlightenment, which is the Dalai Lama's teachings on Tsongkhapa's great exposition of the stages of the path. And in the beginning of that book, he says, we all share one planet, survive under one sun. We're simply one community in the face of population growth, that's supposed to say instantaneous communication and modern global economy. In that sense, we are really one entity. So there isn't any separate individual interest. It's almost exactly like what Einstein said. But we have the mistaken view that we're separate from the rest of the world. That's what Einstein called the prison of optical delusion. But based on that, our actions are unrealistic, right? Many people's minds are deeply confused about what happiness is and how to create its causes. Yeah. He means that people are rushing around trying to get more money because that can get them more things, because they think when they get more better things, then they'll be happier. But in fact, he thinks that, right, values such as kindness, generosity, and honesty are actually the roots of human well-being, human flourishing, or happiness. So the only way to safeguard our future as individuals is to develop a sense of concern for the well-being of others and the well-being of all other living beings. And so this is why His Holiness says, I think it's a great line, right? That kindness is my real religion. Different traditions, right, have tremendous philosophical difference, but at the practical level, they're all pointing us in the direction, of love, kindness, forgiveness, tolerance, self-discipline, contentment. I'm a staunch Buddhist, but kindness is my real religion. And when you practice this with a sense of, when you practice, whatever it is that you practice, you practice it with a sense of dedication to the well-being of others, that then you feel yourself fulfilled. yeah, this is the purpose of life, or meaning of our lives. I think it almost exactly tracks with what Einstein was saying years before. And then, of course, Thich Nhat Hanh has his own way of saying this famous passage about there being a cloud in this piece of paper. It's more, yeah, in some Mahayana sutras and in some schools of East Asian Buddhism, there's an idea of just talking about, instead of just talking about interdependence or interconnection, to talk about interpenetration and things sort of being inseparable, or even, that in a way they're not really apart from each other, right? So that's what he's saying. There's a cloud right here in this piece of paper because, there can't be any rain without a cloud, and without the rain, there won't be any trees and won't be any paper, right? So this is everything inter-exists. Everything interbeing is how things exist. So interbeing is a way of talking about dependent arising, but yeah, and it relates to the idea that things are causes and conditions for one another. But yeah, it goes to the extent of saying, yeah, that things, because they're so intrinsically necessary for the others to exist, and none of them exist in and of themselves, that our idea that this exists and that exists, talking in that way, reinforces our sense to exaggerate these things as having their own way of being. So he makes up this word, things, everything inter-exists. Yeah, and it keeps going, like everything is like that. Everything inter-exists just with the piece of paper that he points out. A piece of paper contains the universe. It contains, it contains, in the sense that it entirely depends, in order to arise, non-paper elements like carbon, sun, logger's mother. And yet without these non-paper things, there isn't any paper. So yeah, we can't just be like by ourselves alone. It's not a choice, right? We have to be is always already to interbe. That is to lack, say, if you want to put it in the negative way, it means that we're empty of any natural power of existing just in and of ourselves. And right, he said, we're inevitably vast, because we include everything in as causes and conditions that we think of as other than ourselves. And if he goes on to sort of project that if you really see the world that way and you experience the world that way, like the way Einstein is talking about the end of what our task is, right? If you see things as that way, then caring for others isn't like a sacrifice, but it's a natural response or spontaneous gesture, like, yeah, scratching your own elbow. Yeah, unself-conscious. So one of the things I first looked at before I got to Halifax and Solnet was Martin Luther King. And he has an unfamous sermon called Blasted Hope that you can track down on the internet. And he talks in there about Paul and how Paul thought that he was going to go and missionize Rome. And he ended up going to Rome in chains to be executed. And he says, ultimately, we all die not having received what was promised. That is what our expectations were. We have to determine how to live in a world where our highest hopes are not fulfilled. And the answer lies in developing the capacity to accept finite disappointment and yet cling to infinite hope. Right. So he doesn't use exactly the same words, but they're readily interpretable, that he's like essentially saying the same thing that we've been talking about, right? Because the infinite hope that he talks about is what we're calling wise hope. It's not a hope that knows a particular time in the future when people will be judged only by the content of their character, right? Yeah. It's a confidence in what's already in us. He calls it God, of course. We can call it the unborn or dependent arising or emptiness. Or I like the idea of thinking of it as, our great vow, our commitment, our bodhicitta, right? Or maybe for some people, it's just an intuitive sense that something good is something worth doing, the way Havel says, right? Yeah, that's always there. Even when there seems to be no reason to hope in the sense of having a positive expectation, we still have to be committed. It's interesting in Martin Luther King week having to remember how young he was when he was assassinated. I'm always struck by that. He looks so young in all the pictures. So, uncertainty and committed values, these are the basis of wise hope. Emptiness, the lack of things having any intrinsic nature, entails uncertainty to a greater degree, maybe, than we usually think about. Obviously, if we want to help people, we have to know what they need, but we can't read their minds. Maybe some people can, but yeah, maybe we think we can because we're reading their facial expressions and their body language, and we think we know what's in their hearts. And maybe we get some inkling, right? It's not like we're completely clueless, but we can easily be wrong, very easily be wrong, because we bring our own projections into the situation, right? Yeah. We can't ever get outside our own perspective on how things appear and see what things really are on their own side out there, because emptiness means that there isn't any way in which things exist objectively in and of themselves on their own side apart from a point of view. Everything is dependent on cause and conditions, as Mim was saying earlier, but everything is also dependent on that. Everything that takes up space or time is dependent on parts as well. Yeah. And everything that arises, it depends upon, a certain point of view from which it's appropriately designated as this or that. So even without any ability to get outside ourselves and know what things are objectively, because they don't have any objective reality, we can make progress by trying things and then paying attention to the outcomes, right? And refining our way of practicing, right? That's what skilling means. It's a bit of trial and error in a sense. So in this sense, the practice of the bodhisattva is like science. I'm not saying it's science, by the way, but it's like science in that you try something and then you make refinements in your mode of operation, right? Seeking something closer to effective action. In this case, bodhisattva's effective action to care for others. All right. So it's really famous that Tsongkhapa, Losang Chakpa, the Gelugpa founder, and thus the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana tradition, teach that emptiness does not, I left out a not, does not eliminate convention valid cognition. And this means that even though all things are empty, we obviously can reliably know what's a cat and what's a hat. And by extension, we can distinguish helpful acts from harmful acts, killing from not killing, right? Lying and not lying. But everything's empty, but that doesn't cancel out these conventional distinctions. But it's somewhat less understood that conventional knowledge within emptiness doesn't mean some certainty, right? Conventional reliable knowledge does not mean we can, reach out with our minds and know for certain what's out there, right? And so how can you have conventional reliable knowledge if you can't actually get at some objective status of the object, because there is no objective status of the object? Yeah. The answer is that conventional knowledge within the context of emptiness in the prasangika system of Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa, it means an understanding that has not been discredited. There hasn't been anything that comes up that suggests that that isn't the right way to look at things, right? And it is always possible, and this is easy to understand if you just think about the world. Oftentimes, we can be quite sure of something, right? And feel, if somebody asks you, do you know X? And you would say, yeah. And then you could find out later that you'd actually been wrong. And it wasn't unreasonable, perhaps, for you to have thought that you knew X, but maybe there was some other circumstance that you didn't know that made it turn out that it wasn't exactly like that. So this is what conventional, this is what, you know, if you don't want to call it knowledge, you don't have to, but this is what conventional reliable knowledge means in the context of emptiness. It means that we have a pragmatic way of understanding that a certain approach seems to be the best one. And until some evidence arises that shows that that isn't the best one, then we can reasonably proceed to help people along those lines. Yeah. So that's why uncertainty, like uncertainty and values, ultimate uncertainty does follow from the idea that things are empty. Because of this, you know, we don't really know what the outcomes of our actions will be. The results, the ultimate outcomes are unknowable. They're not under our control. What do, you know, many, you know, philosophers have said, figure out what you can control and focus on that, right? Yeah. But what is control? We can control our own choices, the way we direct our minds, the way we use our time, the way we use our money. These are our choices, right? And they make a difference in the future of the world. And we don't necessarily see that difference in our lifetime, the way Olive Schreiner didn't, for example, in South Africa. But we shouldn't base our life on outcomes or, you know, our expectations or our need to see certain results of our doing the right thing, right? If you act with a true intention to be helpful, at least one person will benefit. This is like a line that His Holiness the Dalai Lama likes to use and laugh, right? If you're really trying to help someone else, at least one person will benefit. All right, obviously, that means the person who's genuinely has an intention to help. Yeah. But, you know, if you have a true intention to help, right, and it turns out that you come to understand that you were, in fact, the only person who benefited from that action, then the next time, you know, you can refine your approach, right, and act in a different way, because you knew your previous actions weren't as helpful as you thought they would be. Yeah. This reminded me, my grandmother spent a part of her life helping poor women in El Salvador and helping them with infant nutrition, especially. And, you know, during her lifetime, during the period of time, maybe 15 or 20 years she was doing this work, the situation in El Salvador just continuously got worse and worse. And eventually she had to leave El Salvador. And by the time she died, the situation there was absolutely horrible. Okay. So this is the standard example in my mind of, you know, social action that's based on expectation of seeing positive change, you know, in your lifetime. And that's it's good to have positive intentions. It's not bad karma, obviously. It's good karma, right? But it's the good karma that's part of cyclic existence, right? Yeah. So there's this idea, how can we be helpful given uncertainty, right? How can we, what approach should we have? And the thing that I find most useful is the 3 tenets, which is made up apparently by Bernie Glassman Roshi, a Zen teacher from New York City, right? Who passed this idea on to his student, Joan Halifax Roshi, and then she uses it in in her teaching, in the Upaya Zen Center in New Mexico, and also in training hospice workers. And the three tenets are simply not knowing, bearing witness, and compassionate action. So not knowing is this uncertainty, right? You have to know that you don't really know, right? If you think you know, your likelihood of effectiveness is going down sharply because you're not psychic, right? And you don't actually know all the conditions and causes that are operating in the context into which you're moving. And you don't also know what's going on in other people's minds. And you don't necessarily know all their family and cultural background or their trauma history. You don't know, right? And so that you have to start by knowing that you don't know. The uncertainty, or, in the implication is in the context of emptiness, right? Understanding emptiness reminds us of the fundamental not knowing condition, right? And if you ground yourself in this not knowing, right, then when you go into a condition of coming to a situation where you want to be of help, you don't go in thinking, oh, I'm going to say some mantras on these people. You go in paying attention and seeing what's happening, right? You go in with your eyes and your ears and your heart open, rather than your hands already full of the, your prayer wheel or your cross or your Bible or your sutra. Yeah. Paying attention, being fully present, right? And then if you do that, you should try actually practicing it, I think we all think we know things that could be helpful to other people. And so if you approach, like if you have a friend who's grieving, I mean, it is a practice to intentionally bracket or set to the side all the stuff you think you know that would be helpful to tell them, and instead just be with them and listen and be present. And then, yeah, you can become attuned, one hopes, right? You can be tuned in, you can be, you can sync up with that person, right? And a natural caring response, because that's your intention, can just flow out from that. That seems the best approach that I've heard of. There's John Halifax. So we can't expect this to work. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? Right. If you expect, damn it, I'm going to do the three tenets and it's going to work, right? Then you're back in the same problem again. You have to expect that sometimes it will fail, right? You're doing something that maximizes your chances of actually being helpful to that person, and you're acting on good intentions. But yeah, there's so much pain in the world, right? And even when we do our very best, right? Yeah, we're doing what we can. Right? We can't make everything okay. And sometimes, even with good intentions and the three tenets, we don't actually succeed in making things better. This Daniel Berrigan quote. And then, yeah, one of my favorite quotes from the Jewish tradition: you're not required to complete the healing of the world, but you may not desist. Yeah. Both of these go the direction is like, yeah, you have to have realistic expectations. We're determined to save all living beings, but do you expect that to happen? Are you expecting that to come about? Yeah, yeah. So Shantideva gives us he says a few things that are reassuring along that line, If the problem can't be solved, why worry? If the problem can be solved, why worry? Just, get to work. If the problem can't be solved, worrying isn't going to do any good. No, we don't have to worry. We just have to look at the problem and work the problem and see if we can have an approach that might be helpful, and then don't assume that it is helpful, but work on getting the feedback and refining our approach. Yeah. Shantideva also has this other passage that I didn't quote here, where he's talking about, you know, the Bodhisattva sacrificing herself, offering herself up for the benefit of other beings, even to the extent of offering her own flesh to, you know, there's a Jataka story where a Bodhisattva offers his flesh to a starving tiger. And so, for example, and Shantideva talks about this, you know, as it's a means of expressing the intensity of the commitment and the devotion to serving other beings. But then he follows up by saying, you know, it's not a good idea to just start out doing this kind of, you know, thing. And in the beginning, maybe you should, you know, offer some vegetables or something, right? So yeah, we can't, right, have an inflated idea of how much we're, you know, realistically going to be able to accomplish. But we don't really know. So if you do your best and to act in a good way, you may be planting seeds for something great to happen in the future. All right. Yeah. Wise hope. It's the courage to love even when all hope in the ordinary sense is gone, when you have no reasonable expectations of anything good coming about. Right. Yeah. Do the work of love anyway. Yeah. This is a thought that I just had today and added in. You know, people say such and such will give us, you know, am I giving you hope? Am I giving you hope by giving this talk? No, right? People can raise expectations, right, in that conventional sense, right? But wise hope isn't something that you can really give to another person, right? Because it's the idea, the internal commitment, right, to doing something because it is good, not because you reasonably expect it will pay off, because it's your best idea of what the good thing to do is, right? You can't give that to another person. But wise hope, you know, this kind of uncertainty plus commitment is mutually reinforcing with active engagement that is actually doing something. When you see someone actually acting for the good, behaving as a bodhisattva, at least from your point of view, right? That doesn't give you hope, but it inspires you by showing you a moral exemplar, to use some, you know, an Aristotelian phrase. You know, so this doesn't literally give you hope, but it could inspire us, right, to make a commitment and to act in a way that that person is acting. When we see people acting and when we act ourselves, that raises commitment. And when we make commitment, that drives action. So I was thinking of these wise hope as being like the aspirational bodhicitta, right? And active engagement is like engaged bodhicitta, you know, practical bodhicitta, actually doing things in the world. Yeah. They're mutually reinforcing, is my point. It's not just that commitment drives action. Action is part of what supports and reinforces commitment. And it's also important to remember that these, you know, bodhisattvas, people that we see as like moral exemplars, say the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh or whoever is for you, such a person. They're not, you know, Martin Luther King, is like not a perfect person. Yeah. There aren't any, you don't have to believe that any particular bodhisattva is a perfect person. There's a lot of stages on the bodhisattva path. and there's many different types of bodhisattvas. You know, in the Buddhist pantheon, Mahayana Buddhist pantheon, there are many different bodhisattvas who have different qualities, right? Different kinds of strengths, you could say, right? And when we see people engaging in bodhisattva behavior in the world, right, we can recognize them as embodiments of a bodhisattva archetype, even if they are not perfect human beings, because, like, who is? Yeah. And this idea, this isn't a quote, but this idea of looking for inspirational role models or moral exemplars of, as you know, bodhisattvas in the world. It kind of got that idea. I got that idea from Faces of Compassion, which is a book about bodhisattvas by Taigen Dan Layton, who's a Soto Zen teacher in Chicago, at least last I knew. And there's Shantideva, and we've been talking about a couple different times. And yeah, this is what I'm going to close with, this verse from Shantideva's Bodhisattva Charyavatara, the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. I mean, this is the value commitment of bodhicitta. For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then, may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. Screen sharing window has closed. Have I stopped screen sharing?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That's what I was trying to do, but I didn't know whether I succeeded. I talked for almost an hour and a half, but yeah, still, I think Bryant has raised his hand.
Yes, thank you very much for a second installment of a very inspiring line of thought. Your quotes and your ideas give rise to many reminders from my own lifetime collection of similar kinds of things. But I want to take exception in a compassionate way to your own statement that you can never give another person hope. And it may be just the context in which you meant that, but I would maybe make the point that, for example, you gave me an immense amount of hope simply by the things you did in your life to choose a path that ultimately led to you publishing this book on emptiness, which was hugely influential in my understanding of that concept, and which led me to others, which kept expanding my understanding of it until I realized some of these sort of ethical and soteriological implications of it, that every moment is empty of whatever we think it inherently has, which therefore by definition means there's always hope. And every moment things can be better, even if only minutely, maybe just from a shift in perspective. So and I'll finish my disagreement with your with your statement in an affirmative way by paraphrasing the Diamond Sutra. Better than giving alms, better than giving all this stuff, is teaching one verse of this sutra, the implication being when you teach someone, when you open their mind to the idea, however you phrase it, openness, emptiness, uncertainty, not knowing, but the positive implications of that's like thermonuclear positivity in my book.
Yeah.
So
thanks. Thanks, Brian. I feel listening to you tonight and also before that you really have been gotten an understanding of emptiness and its positive implications in a deep way, and that is something. When I was in grad school and I was setting out to try to understand Madhyamika philosophy and what the hell Nagarjuna was saying, I did not find it in books really, but I had this idea this would be something I would like to understand, and I was fortunate enough that different circumstances came together such that I was able to get an understanding of it, and then I was actually given opportunity to share it with other people in a variety of ways. and it's not suitable medicine for everybody. But it is obviously for you and for me, right? So that's bringing some benefit along the lines of what you quoted from the Diamond Sutra, and it gives me joy. What I mean by not being able to give someone else hope, I mean, that's an expression that we have. But I think when we say that, we usually, what we mean is end up meaning is raising somebody's expectations about what's going to happen. And
Right.
what you're talking about maybe is, to me, it's more like, yeah, you're giving the benefit of sharing the Dharma. And you also can be, it's like I've tried to suggest the importance of inspiring role models there at the end, right? And to inspire somebody, we could say, I guess, that that's a way of giving hope. But
Absolutely.
but really, hope has to be a commitment that a person makes, and you cannot, just like you cannot wash away people's bad karma with water or mantras, you can't instill into someone else a commitment to care for other beings. Just
Well,
not.
this is why it's so important what you mentioned earlier about combining that knowledge of uncertainty with a commitment to values, setting your intention. Everything rests on the point of intention, right? And even if things are 99% dark, we don't have to let that defeat us mentally or spiritually or emotionally. We can continue, the Metta Sutta, we can continue loving and sending out compassion and, finding inspiration in others' success. That's always possible. To me, that's why it's immeasurable. It's always there,
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for those comments.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question? It looks
Yeah,
like maybe
may I?
Catherine does.
May
Yeah.
I? Yes. 2 points about just the last point now. I heard the word wise hope, and that's probably where the difficulty comes, that the hope and the wise hope are different animals, that you cannot just throw wisdom to somebody else. So that's probably where you were also seeing some limitation of the hope that I heard, if I'm correct.
There's right. There's two
And
points that what Bryant was referring to. So that I had values and uncertainty are the basis of wise hope. And the values part was what I was talking about, because a commitment to care for other beings isn't something you can instill into someone else. But also your point is also correct. You can't actually change a person's mind either on the wisdom side or the values side, right? You can just share the Dharma. You have a share the Dharma time and see what happens.
Exactly. And I have another question that sort of sticks in my head since last time. There is a poem or something. I cannot know if it's Milarepa, Shantideva. There is like a lion, I have no fear, and like duck, 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 I have no hope. And there's a few lines like this. And
really? I'll look that up. Yeah.
because somehow it just bothers me that there is a very well said something about hope, and I couldn't figure it out where of those major writers it came from.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to try to track that down. I'm not going to do it.
There's like 6 lines about
I get it.
like
Yeah.
tuck, tuck, like tuck, tuck, tuck.
Yeah. It's like poetry. I get it. No,
Right.
I'll look for it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, Min. Let's see. Unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You
Yeah.
can also see this fantastic mandala that you have behind you.
Oh.
Nice.
Thank you. I think this is the mandala of Amita use, I think.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah. So I actually I'm kind of want to explore your opinion a little bit about a question I have. So basically, in the Buddhist tradition, and they talk a lot about like causes condition and karma and cause in the mind. And I think one of the idea that sometimes, float around in some of this theory is that we're here because we actually have the karma to be here. You know what I mean? Like all of the all of these area beings, all of the enlightened beings, they have moved on to some other realm, and we kind of like here because we have the karma to be here. So it kind of reminds me of this story, in Ireland, they have this mythology where the first being in Ireland were this sort of fairy-like being, and then when the first human arrived on this island, this fairy first, tried to use different kind of magic to keep out this human by raising the wave and things like that, and somehow human, using our ingenuity and determination and a little bit aggressiveness, we managed to like push through this barrier that this fairy erected. But then when the first human sort of landed on island, all of this fairy, they sort of like disappear into their own dimension, And so I think we are here in the idea is that we're here because we are a little bit like, in some sense, a little bit of like tactical, acumen, violent, aggressiveness in some sense. So like in some way, we can kind of see it even in language, like when we talk about corporate office, we talk about HQ, headquarter, like
Headquarters.
headquarter, yeah, it's the military terms,
Yeah. I see.
Headquarter, or when we have an emergency, we call it a war room, for example. It's a military term. So I'm kind of curious to hear about, if you have talked about this thing, like we're here because we have some amount of violent aggressiveness in us, and that's why our type of society is sort of like percolating the way it is right now.
Okay. Thanks. So first of all, it's important to remember that in the Buddhist tradition, it's very rare and valuable, precious to be born as a human being. Every tradition I've seen says that, all the different kinds of ways that you can be reborn in cyclic existence, including as various types of gods, are in various ways less optimal in terms of seeking liberation than the human rebirth. And in a way that sort of is importantly relevant, but goes in a different direction from what you're saying, that the main cause of being born as a human being in traditional Buddhist karma teaching is ethical behavior in a past lifetime. And by ethical behavior, specifically, it means restraining violent action. So, in other words, we're different from the basic teachings of the traditional teachings about karma distinguish humans from natural predators, I guess you would say, and saying maybe if we have predatory inclination, we also karmically have the capacity to restrain predatory inclinations. And it's on the basis of our exercising capacity to restrain predatory behavior that we had the good fortune to be born as humans in the first place. So that's like super important to remember. Now, as far as what you're talking about, absolutely, the militaristic language pervades, many different cultures. You see it also in Buddhist texts too, right? And the idea in Buddhist texts, like for example, Thich Nhat Hanh says famously, "Who is our real enemy? We need to know who the enemy is," right? And then when you read on in his texts or in Tsongkhapa's texts or other texts where they talk about use military metaphors, it's like, no, the enemy is never another living being. The enemy is greed and hatred and delusion that we all have, right? And those are our enemies, are the common enemies, right? Not each other. And so that's the way the Buddhist tradition takes military rhetoric and sort of turns it against itself in a sense and says, yeah, if you want to fight, here's where the real enemies are. And then finally, in terms of you're talking about like our basic nature, there's two kind of views about that in the Buddhist tradition. I mean, obviously, karmically, our circumstances, our human rebirth is primarily the fruit of good karma from a past lifetime. But when you say, is our basic nature, or fundamental nature, malign, or is it neutral, or is it positive, right? So in some traditions, such as Calvinism and many other types of Protestant Christianity, the idea is that we're basically very bad. Yeah, our badness goes all the way down, right? Total depravity is the term that's used by Calvin. So even when we're trying to do something good, in that view, it's always contaminated by this core of self-centeredness and selfishness that we have. And that tradition looks at as that the negative aspect of that is the fundamental nature, okay? You see a little bit of that in Pure Land sometimes. That's the only place I know of it in the Buddhist tradition. And that's why the tradition focuses on, you don't have the wherewithal within yourself, and you have to turn to a higher power. But in most of the Buddhist tradition, the view is that the basic nature, the fundamental nature of human beings is either positive or open. Let's put it that way. And the tradition that I've been teaching within the way that I approach things, the emptiness, the Madhyamaka tradition, it tends to look at our basic nature as open. We don't have any essential nature, and that's what makes it possible for all different kinds of things to happen. Anything that possibly could exist, we could manifest or become, because we don't have any nature of being locked into being any particular thing. That's the argument that's like, oh, how could I possibly become a Buddha? That sounds super impossible, right? And the idea is, well, you're just thinking that you're basically intrinsically like the way you are now. But if everything's completely empty over time, any kind of transformation is possible. So that's one approach, is say people don't have any fundamental nature as good or bad. They have infinite possibilities of transformation. And then the other more or less half of the Buddhist world wants to say that our basic nature is fundamentally good and that we are Buddhas from the very beginning, right? You find this you find this in many parts of Tibetan Buddhism and also many parts of the Chan Zen East Asian tradition as well, that we're non-different from Buddha from the very beginning. That is true, because there's no essential difference between us and Buddha. But and so that can be taken in the Tathagata Garbha tradition, which greatly influences Tantra, greatly influences a number of the different Tibetan traditions, and greatly influences a number of Chan and Zen teachers, is that we're fundamentally Buddhas from the very beginning. And so the very depths of our being is a core of loving care, right? Rather than a core of hate. And so to know our deepest selves is to realize ourselves as something fundamentally good. And that's what, for example, in the United States, one of the most popular types of Buddhism for a while has been, the Shambhala tradition that was like initiated by Trungpa Rinpoche, and downstream, it's a part of the Kagyapa tradition from Tibetan Buddhism. And in that lineage, the teachers say basically you should believe in fundamental goodness. That's what we're trying to realize is our fundamental goodness, and that if people are confused and lost and feeling helpless, you as a guru in that tradition, you should teach them that they're Buddhas, right? And that for some people, okay, it's not me, right? Apparently not Bryant either. But for some people, that is really helpful medicine. And I have kind of grown to understand that can be good medicine, even if it's not my medicine. That's a kind of, yeah, I tried to answer your question on a few different levels. Okay. I think that's enough for tonight. Yeah. Oh, Brian has raised his hand. Okay.
Oh, I'll just be really quick. I've thought a lot about this myself, and one teacher made the argument that in the second turning, where the Mahayana appeared, the basic idea was emptiness, but it was so prevalently misunderstood as being nihilism that gave rise at some point to the tendency towards characterizing emptiness in a positive way, which some have argued is the Buddha nature argument, that it's not a inherently existing Buddha inside us, but it is that constant potential we have for improvement all the way up to becoming a Buddha. And that's, and so when I, encounter people that believe in a reified Buddha nature, I don't argue with them, because if that motivates them in good ways, hooray,
Exactly right. Yeah. In fact, I agree with you completely. And in fact, I've seen, in the way he's lived his life and talked to other people, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has not only manifested that with regard to all types of Tibetan Buddhism, but he's also manifested it towards most other religious traditions. For example, he talks to Christian audiences about God. He does not believe in God. He does not believe in an absolute divine creator. He doesn't believe in anything like that. He believes the traditional Buddhist arguments that try to show that such thing as an uncreated creator is logically impossible. That's his personal belief. But when he's with Christians or Muslims or Hindus, he doesn't lay that out for them. Instead, he joins them in prayer and encourages them in their own faith, because he sees that as the inspiration and the source for their kindness in the world, right? He said to people, if you believe in God, then you know that God created us as social beings. There has to be some reason for that. Yeah, because it's in our nature to care for one another, and that's how we find fulfillment, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So he's like, if you believe in God, and he doesn't say, and of course that would be stupid. He doesn't say that, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Min. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you. Yeah, Catherine, Sheila, Ranji, Maeve. And I'm going to go now. And
Thanks to you.
oh, yeah. Maybe by next week, I'll think of something else to say. But
just, do you mind? If you had a sentence about Shantideva, very last sentence, that sounded almost like a Stoic, the sort of Stoicism, to accept. It was one of your very last sentences about that you accept things. If you cannot change it, you accept them.
Yeah. That's a very famous passage.
Right.
And it is like Stoicism, yeah.
So maybe if you have some ideas to talk about it a little bit next time, would be good.
Okay.
And also a little bit more about your work on ethics and conventional truth.
Okay.
That's your specialty, it seems.
Okay.
So anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll
Thank
see
you.
you. Maybe I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. We can't be certain, but well,
We hope.
We hope.
We hope.
I have wise hope that this may come about. Let us aspire to it. Okay. Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.